department.
Okay,
So,
cool.
I'm Charlene. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in biological sciences. I study amphibians and roads.
Nice.
I'm Major. I'm first year Masters in Financial Economics.
Okay.
I'm Ikria. I'm a second year. I'm in the Department of Mathematics. Yeah.
I'm Kristen. I'm a fifth-year PhD student in the English department.
Oh yeah.
And I also work for the College of Arts and Sciences.
Okay, yeah.
Forum and newsletter.
Okay, great. Are you doing an introduction or anything, or
I can.
do you also, if you want to,
Oh,
sure,
Yeah.
because then you can also put that on your resume. We can go ahead and
Okay.
yeah. Oh, we'll let them.
Okay. What's your last name?
Lillvis. Yep.
Okay.
Can you record this one? Is it recording?
Yes.
Okay, welcome everyone, and today we're here to hear our Ohio alum Kristen Lillvis. She earned her MA here at OU in English, so fellow English department grad. This is exciting. In 2006, and she's
Oh yeah,
currently,
6. I said 4 earlier.
she's currently the associate professor of English and director of digital humanities at Marshall University, where she teaches courses on digital humanities and contemporary American and African American literature. Her research explores issues of identity and diverse texts across a range of media, with specific attention made to works of electronic literature, so definitely something that's a major concern and area of interest and excitement in the field right now. This is fantastic. In terms of recent publications include a scholarly monograph, Post-Human Blackness and the Black Female Imagination from University of Georgia Press just last year, very exciting. And the co-edited collection, Community Boundaries and Border Crossings, Critical Essays on Ethnic Women Writers.
All right. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
And we introduced ourselves at the beginning. Would you, if you just came in, mind telling me your name and what department you're in?
Yeah, my name is Noor. I'm doing applied economics, master's in applied economics, and recently I've been taking a few classes in finance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm Gifty Johnson, the financial economics program.
Okay. So I'm excited that everybody's in such different fields. And so I have a few things I'm going to run through, but if you would like at any point to stop me and ask me to pause and say, how does this apply to me? Or can you tie this to econ or math or chemistry or whatever? I'd be happy to give it a go. I will say I've done some work. One of my favorite people in the world is a math professor that I work with regularly. So I do a lot of work, surprisingly, with math. I also have done some work with people in business and economics on some projects. And then my new project has to do a little bit with neurobiology, but I'm really bastardizing it and applying it to literature, so I have to be honest about that. So I just want to talk about why you might collaborate together, right? How the people in this room, how you all might be able to help each other. And one way you can do that is through this field called digital humanities. Have people heard about DH before? Some yes, some no. It's a buzzword, at least on the arts and humanities side of things. I don't know if the STEM people care about it all quite so much, but the reason I like it is because I think the name, one, it's kind of not useful because what does it mean? But it is also useful because those two words independently are clear. So for me, digital humanities as a humanities person is useful because that word digital suggests that I have some technology and even then getting beyond technology to thinking about computer science and beyond the humanities abilities that make me appeal to people who maybe aren't focused on the arts and the humanities. what digital humanities is very broadly is bringing together anything that looks at technology and the arts and humanities. So thinking about how technology can help us answer questions about the world. And that's really this broad way that I define it. I find it useful, again, for arts and humanities grad students. This is an article from the Chronicle from 2017, and it's talking about people on this arts and humanities side. It's one of the few fields that has had some protection on the academic job market, that is, in fact, is shown some growth. And so if you're on that side, it's useful to you. If you're not, though, if you're on the STEM side, why might you care about digital humanities? This is an article from the Washington Post, and it's talking about Google employees' top qualities. So there have been some studies done on this, and the top skill that Google employees were looking for, and I'll read them to you. It was that their employees were a good coach, they were good at communicating and listening, they possessed insights into others, including empathy, they were good critical thinkers and problem solvers, and they make connections across complex disciplines. After all of that was they have a technical skill. And so the other reason I like digital humanities, because if you are somebody in one of those fields, you now have the word humanities lumped on to whatever you're doing, and that suggests critical thinking and problem solving that might be useful in your field. Because even if you aren't in a field that's going to require you to write very often, you still have to write to get that job, and you have to do presentations usually or communicate with others. And so if you can show that you have some skills in that, possibly through DH, that's one way to make some advancements. So what does it look like? For me, I see interdisciplinary collaboration in every facet of what I do. So this is just a flyer from a course that I'm team teaching now that's called Coding for the Digital Humanities. And it's me, a faculty from computer science, and a faculty member from math, actually. And we are teaching students Python, and we are teaching them how to analyze texts using Python. So for the portion of the class where students are using Python, I sit with them and I learn Python too. But then I stand up and say, okay, now that we've gotten this skill and we can do this text analysis, why? And so I talk about research questions that they might want to investigate, and I talk about ways to move forward with, if you have all of this textual data, what are you going to do with it? Why? Why is it there? Why are you analyzing it? This has been fantastic. One, I'm learning new ways to teach because I'm working with people in computer science and math, and they've communicated as well that they're learning new ways to teach. We're talking about projects we can work on together going forward, which is useful for me because it opens me to new sources of funding, and it opens them to new sources of funding. So if we think about grant funding, which as you go forward might be a major way that you either get a job or maintain a job, I, in the humanities, am not going to get as much grant funding as somebody in the sciences, probably. However, I might have some sources of funding that are easier to get, even if they're smaller. So state humanities councils, for example, are often a good way to get funding. You can't maybe get that on a straight economics or math or science project, but if you tie to somebody in the humanities, you can get that. And so that's a way to move forward. Think about how this collaboration is going to be useful. For research, I'm working on a research project that is involving mapping narratives of recovery from substance use disorders. And I have team members in English, geography, digital humanities, addiction studies, and the wellness program. And again, we're open to funding opportunities that none of us would ever have if we were just working alone. So by collaborating, we're able to get these external sources of funding. And this might be of some interest to the people who are in economics, for example. I was part of a team that Intuit sponsored a Design for Delight competition at my university. So Intuit's the TurboTax company. And my team won. And I worked with students and faculty in business communication studies, computer science, and English. And so we got to go, they flew us out to Silicon Valley. We met with people at Google and Facebook and the top people at Intuit had one-on-one conversations with us about this project that we came up with over the course of like 2 months. So if you had ever told me that I'd be talking, one-on-one with people at Intuit in California, and I'm an English professor, I would say I don't think that's true, but it did really happen. And so those are links also that are useful, because that experience, the design of this competition was for people to collaborate, and by agreeing to participate in that, I got to make some connections that otherwise I wouldn't have been able to make. So this is just my pitch for why working with people who might seem outside of your field can be really useful. And I have ideas for how, I haven't talked as much about like people in chemistry and things like that and biological sciences, how you could be involved as well. But there are actually, I think, really cool projects that we could see, cross collaboration on. So what questions do you have, or what might I be able to help with?
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Intuit project?
Mm-hmm.
Just kind of what that project looked like, and
Yeah.
some of the details of that kind of collaboration?
Yeah, so
Who
they,
brings what to the table?
Yeah, so Intuit came in and taught us this process called Designing for Delight, and it has to do with rapid prototyping. And they asked people at Marshall, who were formed into teams by a variety of disciplines, to solve some of the biggest problems. And they really did give us, they were like, solve the problem of students not learning enough in elementary school. My team was tasked with solving the problem of substance use disorders. And we were going to do that in 2 months, right? Well, that's sort of impossible. But they know it's impossible. But by giving us such a huge task and saying, go, there's no limit on what your solution could be, we actually came up with some cool things. So my team came up with a virtual reality education solution. We didn't make it, right? It was about making the idea and doing a sort of a rapid prototype that could just be we made fake sunglasses, right? And we said, pretend these are virtual reality goggles. Let me describe to you a scenario. Let me help you and walk you through this experience. And so that was something that was really interesting, working with the people in business and having them talk about what was actually possible, right? What was feasible. The students in communication studies and computer science brought a different perspective. I came from this English side talking about, what we might call it, how we might market in terms of the language of it. And so it was really interesting to see these collaborations I never would have imagined. And out of that now, I can see future collaboration. So there are people now I work with in business, the College of Business, that I never would have met, before this project. And so we're doing a lot of the same things in terms of forming centers for innovation where students can go and work with tools. That's the same thing I'm doing that they're doing. And so what are ways that we can work together on that instead of just reproducing the same thing? Other questions? Yeah.
How do you even begin to search out who to collaborate with?
Great question. One way you can do it is through things like this. So going to a place where you're in a room with lots of different people and saying, so here's the thing I work on, and really being open to other people going, oh, I do something that seems just a tiny bit related, and then making that link. So for example, I've done a project on teaching writing in STEM classes and ways to help students learn how to convey their ideas in writing, even if it's not an essay, if it's literally an answer to a test question, and how you can write better test questions to help students do better in their answers. And that came from, I had a friend in geography, and he was like, or geology rather, and he's like, my students aren't doing well on their tests. And I said, oh man, why? And he's like, I don't know, they keep giving me bad answers. And so then we just started having a conversation, and then we were like, oh, I bet we could study that together. And then we got grant funding to study that. And so really, I think just making sure you're trying to interact with people who aren't just in your program and in your department is really helpful. The other thing I was recommending to some people at my table is if you have an interest and you would like to do something, and a way you can find something to do is to think about something that's topical right now. If you went to the graduate college and said, there are a couple of us in different fields who want to talk about this issue. Is there anything we could do? They would be like, yeah, sure, I'm sure we can set up some event or something where you could just talk with people, right? So we had somebody come in recently who wrote the book, I can't remember the title of it, something about parasites. It was a pretty popular book, and like the parasites all around us and how they're affecting us and things like that. Like, if you were like, I want to talk about this, but I also want somebody in another department and somebody else in this other department, like if you have an idea you'd like to work on, people will help you find the opportunity to do it. Yeah. Does that help? I do think that advice that the grad director or grad chair was talking about, like looking at events that are for graduate students, will help you do that, because then you're forced to interact with lots of other people. Kristen?
That's kind of my question. How do you, like, is there a particular platform or website or social media group or something where you find out about these types of opportunities? Like, I don't know, where you learn about meetings where it's not just your department, right?
Yeah.
It's college-wide, or it's bringing people even better outside of the college.
Yeah.
Right?
I think part of it is you're going to have to ask people who are involved in in that area so they can help you identify what they are. Mm-hmm. So for me, if you're interested in digital humanities, there are a couple of major workshops that happen every year. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest ones that I've went to twice is DHSI, Digital Humanities Summer Institute. It is in Victoria, British Columbia, which is a little far away, right? And it's not free. But there are scholarships for students, and especially if you're going for your first time. And I have gone to that twice, and this last time I was in a group with librarians, people in computer science, people in anthropology, a couple people in English, and it was mostly grad students. And out of that, I now have somebody in there. He runs a podcast and an online journal that I'm working with a group that we're going to submit to. There's other people out of that experience. Somebody said, oh, at my school there's an online journal, but the editors can't do it anymore. And somebody at the conference said, oh, I'd like to do that. That person is now editing this journal, right, that they just met somebody at this conference about. So those types of bigger national or international things, if you can go and look for funding, right, like don't pay to go, try to get the funding to go, can be huge. But finding that is talking to people who are in that field who can tell you what those things are. Other questions?
I know you define the digital humanities, but intuitively, simply what is meant by digital humanities?
What is made or what is meant?
What's meant?
Yeah, so like the definition really I do think is very broadly using technology to answer questions about humanity. So for me, because I am in English and I study texts, a lot of times it's using digital tools to analyze written texts, to analyze language. So there's a bunch of online tools that are free that people can use. I was showing the last group, there's one called Voyant Tools, where you can upload a corpus, so one text or multiple texts, to this site, and it will tell you most used words, frequency, relationships. It'll tell you all these things about one text or 50 texts, right, or more, right? And so that's something, I could do that by reading a book, but I couldn't do that for reading 500 books, right, in any sort of reasonable amount of time, but I can use technology to help me. But it doesn't just have to be that. So for example, I'm working on a project now where we're mapping, so we're taking coordinates that talk about where people felt was significant in terms of a moment for recovery, and those are going to be organized on a map so that you can really track patterns in how the recovery movement is happening in West Virginia and Appalachia and the nation. And so using that digital tool of a map to give us a better sense of how movement is occurring in terms of recovery. So just bringing together some of those different worlds. Yes?
In terms of different projects that you're working on, or more broadly, I guess, in digital humanities, is it typical for one person to sort of take the lead, or is it completely collaborative in terms of, like, I'm thinking about grant funding, for
Yes.
example. How does that work? Is everyone sort of equally involved?
It can depend. So usually digital humanities projects tend to be very collaborative. And so the project I'm working on now, there are 4 of us, I think, or maybe 5 of us, and we see ourselves as equal partners. However, we're going to end up being able to hire on other people to work on the grant who will also be funded, but probably won't be the primary investigators, right? So you will have to pick somebody who's, you know, one or a few people who are the PIs for your project, the primary investigators who are responsible for the grant paperwork. And that tends to be, I think, in an ideal digital humanities world, it's pretty open and equal, though, of course, it depends on the people in the project. Yeah. Other questions?
I just have one more.
Yeah.
It's still kind of related to my first.
No, it's good.
So, like, if you are a professor and you know you want to collaborate with someone to do the specific skill that you might not have, like digitally.
Yeah.
So is there a person at your university that helps connect other people that are looking for collaborations?
Yes.
Or is it just on you to happenstance find someone that could help you with this?
That's an awesome question. So at my university, it's me because I direct the digital humanities program, but we also have a librarian who helps too. So if you're here and you're interested in digital humanities, one of the things they're working on is figuring out who a central person is that you might talk to. And there are a couple people who are talking about who that might be, but one person who is really involved is Janet Carlton in the libraries, and she is a digital humanities or digital reference librarian, and so she would be a person who might not say, here's the answer to what you're looking for, but she can say, here are 3 people you should talk to. So I would really recommend reaching out to her. I think if you're stuck on who to ask about anything, I always say turn to the libraries because they have to deal with everybody. So they don't just talk to one department or one faculty member, they really talk to everyone.
And at OU, there are subject librarians,
Yes.
right? Who, like Lorraine Walkner, for example, is the English department librarian,
Yes.
but she also does film studies, and I think African American studies and dance. So you're absolutely right. That's a great suggestion. That plugging into the library is plugging into everyone.
Yes, and your librarian, so I ran a digital humanities unconference here 2 weeks ago, and one of the biggest groups that attended from Ohio were your librarians. So there's a good chance that if you reach out to somebody who's like your disciplines librarian, that person may have been there. If not, they know one of the 10 other librarians who was. Yeah. Well, I think we're supposed to stop. But thank you all for being here. I have my card if there's any additional questions you might have or anything I can help you with. I think I maybe mentioned I was the grad director at Marshall for like 5 years until this year it stopped. So if you also just have questions about grad school and how to make sure you're an attractive applicant, if you're applying, well, are you all PhD students? Okay, yeah. Not all. So if you're not a PhD student, about applying to PhDs, but if you're a PhD student also about going on the job market after, I'd be happy to talk about that too.
I have a question about that. So,
Yes.
If you are planning to go to a PhD, usually what you do is that on the internet, every university has their application page, where normally you pay a fee, like maybe $25
Yes.
or $50. But then the whole application is they have customized it for their own university, and it takes a lot of time.
Yes.
So what my friend suggested, one of my friends is already a PhD, and he told me that you can actually go into the university department page and talk to one of the faculty that you are interested to be working with, so you can directly email them that you are interested in their program and that you want to apply, and then you can just send your application through an email, not the university page. You would save a lot of time and you would save some money. How true is that?
So usually you do have to ultimately apply through the university page because they will always want your money. There are different fields though where you might have to work with a particular faculty member and be sort of chosen by that faculty member. So there are some cases where you do have to reach out and email that person. And so I would say talk to people who you're working with now in your department because they'll know the most about that. Your department might have a graduate director. If not, I would think about if there anybody in your department who is a newer hire. So that is another thing too, is sometimes the graduate director isn't somebody who's necessarily been a graduate student recently, and this is same for job market stuff. If you have a job placement person in your department, that isn't necessarily somebody who's been on the job market recently. So also reach out to somebody who is newer because that person can give you really contemporary advice. Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you all.